So I've been using the iPhone 15 Plus for 3 months now, and here's how I feel about using it after the 3 month period. So when it comes to the design, I have no complaints at all. It feels very premium in the hands. It's also very comfortable to use. Just keep in mind, if you are going to be getting this, I would highly recommend you getting a screen protector and a case because this is a big screen phone, and especially with this phone, I really do feel like it's very slippery and you can easily break this phone quite easy, so just keep that in mind. One thing I do like about this phone, for a big screen phone at 6.7 inches, I do feel like this phone is very lightweight for what it is. There are some phones around this size and a little bit bigger that are more heavier, so I am glad the weight distribution on this phone is actually quite nice because I'm not really a big fan of phones that are too heavy, so it's nice that it doesn't feel too heavy for a big screen smartphone. Now you can see right here I do have the black variant, and so far it's holding up extremely well considering I don't use a case all the time. I pretty much just take this in and out of my pocket, and I also set it down on different surfaces, and so far it looks like the day I actually got it out of the box, which is actually nice. Now I can't comment on the actual screen because I do use screen protectors, so I don't know how well the screen would actually hold up over time under normal use, but it is what it is. Now, one thing I do like about this phone and the design is the fact that it does have a matte finish on the back, which doesn't really show a lot of fingerprints or a lot of scratches or a lot of smudges and things like that. On occasion, I will get smudges, but typically I just wipe this phone down and I'm good to go when it comes to that. I also love the fact that the matte finish is pretty much around the whole entire body of the phone. And then on the right side, of course, you do got your sleep wake button right there. You press to turn it off and on, and then of course you do have your volume up and down on the left side, and then you still have that silent switch on the side, because this one, unlike the 15 Pro and Pro Max, does not get the action button, but I don't think that's too big of a deal not to have the action button. Now, one nice thing this phone does have, actually all iPhone 15s have, is the introduction of USB Type-C. Sure, USB Type-C is not new or anything, but it is nice that the iPhones finally have USB Type-C because it does make our lives much more convenient, considering other Apple products already have USB-C anyway, like for instance the iPads and the MacBooks. So it is nice we do have USB Type-C on here. Just keep in mind, if you are going to be getting the 15 and 15 Plus this time, the base models, you'll be limited to USB 2.0 speeds rather than 3.0 speeds. If you want the faster speeds for the port, you will have to go with the 15 Pro and Pro Max this time around. Keep in mind as well, even though we do have a USB-C port at the bottom, you do not get faster charging speeds, even though we do got a new port. So it is what it is when it comes to that. Now let's talk about my experiences with iOS and how I feel about this device on a day-to-day basis. Now, this device is currently running iOS 17.3, and so far my experiences with iOS have been really good. I have no complaints when it comes to iOS. Sure, there may be bugs and glitches here and there, but for me, I really haven't noticed anything that would make me stop using the phone. It just feels very nice to use. I have no complaints when it comes to that. Now let's actually talk about the differences between this and the iPhone 15 Pro Max this time around, because there are some differences between this and the 15 Pro Max. First off, let's talk about the screen really quickly. When it comes to the screen on this phone, it's a really nice display. It pretty much shares the same display as all the 15 line. Whether you buy this or the Pro models this year, you're still getting the same exact screen, which is nice, which you couldn't say last year about the iPhone 14 line, because the base models only got the big notch instead of the dynamic island. But this year they decided to give the dynamic island to every single iPhone 15 model, which is actually really nice, and I'm glad they did because it is a little bit nicer and it's a little bit smaller than the notch, and I actually like it. And they do give out some functionality on the dynamic island, whether you're in some music applications or showing a timer, or you want to see your travel information when you're flying and things like that. It'll go up on the dynamic island. Even though that stuff is kind of nice, I will have to admit I am ready to actually move on from the dynamic island. I just wish somehow, some way, they can get these notches and punch outs on the screen under the display. I know the technology already exists, and I really wish they would do it sooner rather than later, because I am tired of actually using these devices that do actually have cutouts and punch outs. It's time to get rid of them. We've had that for quite some time, and sometimes it can be a little distracting considering it does cut into certain content content, which is kind of annoying, but it is what it is when it actually comes to that. The color representation on the screen is also very nice. It also has a very high PPI, I think at 460 pixels per inch when it comes to that. So overall, nobody's going to have a problem with the actual display. The only downside to this display is the fact that it doesn't have Pro Motion, and I can see that being a big con for some people just because the price of this phone is $900 and you're so close to the Pro phones anyway. And there are other Android smartphones that are even cheaper than this phone that do have a higher refresh rate screen. But so far, my experiences have been great. It does feel very snappy. It does feel very smooth to actually use, at least when we talk about iOS standards. I think 60 hertz is still plenty fast and still very usable, considering this phone doesn't feel like it's outdated, doesn't feel like it's bogged down by having 60 hertz. But again, it does suck that this phone does have a 60 hertz display just because the price of this phone. Maybe it would be a little bit more excusable if it was cheaper, but since it's so expensive at $900, I really can't excuse Apple from not putting it in this phone. They really need to put even a 90 hertz display in some of their base model phones. It's time, again, considering some Android manufacturers do actually have refresh rates higher than 60 on even some base models and even some cheaper options that are way more cheaper than this phone. So it is unexcusable. One thing I don't like about this phone for sure, as you can see right there on camera, it does get very glary. Now keep in mind, again, like I said, I do have a screen protector on here, but even without a screen protector, most of the time these phones do get pretty glary, so just keep that in mind. One thing I do wish this phone actually had on the screen was actually a higher nit rating for the brightness. Sure, it's bright enough for most scenarios, but if you're like me and you do go outside quite often and you do use your phones in broad daylight, sometimes I feel like it's still not bright enough, even in max brightness. I feel like they need to make these screens a little bit brighter, and there are some phones on the market that do get brighter than the iPhones do, so they do need to do that as well for people like me who use them in broad daylight. But if you don't use it in broad daylight, then I don't think you'll have a problem at all. For most scenarios, I would say 99% of the time, you're not going to have a problem with the brightness of the screen because it does get fairly bright for what it is when it actually comes to that. Now let's talk about some of the differences between this and the 15 Pro Max this time around, because you can kind of say this is a cut down 15 Pro Max, and you can also argue this is also just a 14 Pro Max in disguise, because it does take a lot from the 14 Pro Max and kind of dumbs it down, so you can look at it either way. Now this does have the A16 Bionic chip from the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and it has 6 gigs of RAM, and I think that chip is still well fine for this phone, and even for today's standards, considering a lot of people don't do anything too taxing on their phones. They're checking social media, they're making calls, they're texting, they're taking pictures, they're even if you're heavy multitasking on this phone or even playing games and things like that. I really do feel like this phone is up to the task when it comes to how iOS performs and how the A16 Bionic chip with 6 gigs of RAM holds up. I think it holds up just fine. It's kind of unfortunate for the price point, it's not getting the A17 chip that the 15 Pro and Pro Max have this time around. That chip does have some advantages, especially if you play games. More particularly, there are a couple of games you can only play on the 15 Pro and Pro Max because they are supporting the A17 chip, which does have accelerated ray tracing, and then it does play some console quality games. In particular, it can play some of the Resident Evil games on the A17 chip, but it is what it is when it actually comes to that as well. And with this phone, but yeah, performance has been really great. Now let's actually talk about something that is one of the most important parts of a phone, of course, the battery life. When it comes to battery life on this phone, even at 100% battery life, I will have to say this is easily one of the best smartphones out there for battery life. If you are looking for a phone that can last you almost 2 days, this phone could easily last you throughout the day. I think it's a combination of it only having a 1080p screen combined with only a 60 hertz display and the A16 Bionic chip being really optimized with iOS. This phone gets really good battery. Of course, your mileage may vary, but I really do think a lot of those commercials that are currently going around for the 15 Plus are actually accurate. They do state this does have long battery, and that is accurate. If you want one of the best phones out there just purely on battery life, then I would look at the iPhone 15 Plus for sure. I'm getting crazy battery. Even when I go to bed sometimes, I'm still left with like 45, sometimes even close to 50% battery, depending on how heavy my day is. Even on more heavier days where I'm really taxing the phone, I'm playing some games here and there. I'm also doing a lot of multitasking. I'm taking a lot of pictures throughout the day. I'm doing a lot to tax the phone. I'm still easily left with like 30% battery left. Sure, it's not technically a 2-day phone, even for my standards, just because I do a lot of heavy stuff on my phone. So typically I still charge it at nighttime when I'm done, because I'm a pretty heavy user when it comes to my devices and my usage of my phone. But if you're a much more lighter person that only calls here and there throughout the day, maybe you check a couple websites throughout the day, you're only checking email, you're checking social media every once in a while, and you're not turning on the device all the time, this could easily be a 2-day phone. And that's the biggest reason to actually buy this phone, just due to the fact that it is a 2-day phone. And I did forget to mention, talking about the display really quickly, this does not have an always on display. But I don't really care about always on displays as well. They're a nice benefit, but it's not that big a deal. It doesn't have an always on display. Besides that, it does say battery as well with the always on display. Now you can see right there, unlike the Pro and Pro Max, it doesn't have a telephoto lens, so it doesn't have that third lens. But for me, it doesn't matter. It can still go to 2x, and I think for a lot of people that's still plenty, considering this phone does take really good pictures. You'll have no problem with the picture quality of this phone, whether we're talking about pictures, whether we're talking about things like video. I will have to admit, in my personal opinion, I still think iPhones take the best video in the business when we're talking about pure raw video. If you just want the best videos you can possibly take on your phone, and you take a lot of video and you want to use a you want to use a smartphone for a video camera, I still think iPhones are the way to go when it actually comes to that. But yeah, that's pretty much going to wrap up my review, or my thoughts on the iPhone 15 Plus this time around. This is a pretty nice smartphone for what it is. Sure, it's missing some features again from the iPhone 15 Pro Max from this year. It doesn't have the Pro Motion display and always on display. It's missing the telephoto from the back. It doesn't have the action button, but that doesn't really matter. It's missing the A17 chip with 8 gig of RAM. This is only running the A16 chip with 6 gigs of RAM instead of the A17. And overall, it's very lightweight for a big screen phone, and I've had no problems with this phone. It's kind of interesting to me that some people out there don't necessarily talk about this phone, but I think this isn't, I wouldn't say a sleeper phone, but it is a phone if you just want crazy battery and you just want iOS to actually work, and you just want a phone that's going to function and do everything you need to do on a smartphone. This will get the job done. I guess I did forget to mention as well, I'm kind of over the fact iOS is a little bit too basic at this point. We've had this iOS for many, many years now, and especially if you're coming from a little bit older phone, you won't really feel like you're getting an upgrade, just because iOS is still iOS. But apparently that's supposed to change when we get iOS 18 later this year, because iOS 18 apparently is supposed to be one of the biggest updates to iOS we had since iOS 7. So that should tell you something, and hopefully they do bring some new features to iOS, because iOS is getting stale at the very moment. Not to say that it works, and it works just fine if you don't want to think about your smartphone and you just want to use a smartphone with pretty much just a basic layout and a basic setup. It'll get the job done, but I really wish there was a little bit more you can do out of iOS. But that's what you expect when you buy an iPhone. You expect it to just work, and work extremely well for what it is, and have no major hiccups, no major problems, and things like that. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the iPhone 15 Plus. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne signing out.